Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Now let's get the program started. The humanitarian community in Nigeria called for urgent support for vulnerable people in the northeastern part of the country as the number of people in need of life-saving aid has risen sharply. At the same time, people's living conditions and the security situation have significantly deteriorated since the beginning of the year. The number of people needing humanitarian assistance is the highest ever recorded in 5 years of a joint humanitarian response. Those are the words of Edward Callan, UN resident and humanitarian coordinator in Nigeria. We have 3 people to help us dissect this morning. We have Crystal Chigbu, Executive Director, Irede Foundation, and she's with us in our studio in Lagos. Good morning. Joining us from Abuja is the Country Director, Social Welfare, Mr. Emmanuel Osemeke. Good morning.
Good morning, Alera. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for joining us. We also expect the Acting Humanitarian Operations Manager, Save the Children International Nigeria, to join us from Maiduguri anytime from now. Now, let me start with you, Crystal. Why are these numbers rising so sharply?
I think it's really worse now because of COVID-19. People have always been in need of aid and you have a lot of things going wrong. And so you need to always give support as the case may be. But with COVID-19, you cannot even reach the people that you want to give help to as much as you want to. And if you look at the rising cases, especially in the Northeast, it's even worse because you have these armed groups even trying to, put a barrier between the people that want to make the aid happen and the people that you want to give the aid to. So it's really been a tough period, especially for us also that work in the areas of disabilities. And persons with disabilities are even more vulnerable, and women than other people, because somehow you just can't even go to where you get help when you need the help. So I think really the rising cases are as a result of COVID-19, and hopefully as we get vaccines and put help in place, probably it will get better.
Sorry. Emmanuel, there's the issue of people who are displaced, who need aid, and then add to that the issue of COVID-19. So in addition to the work you're doing, there are also health issues for yourselves as well as for the people who require the aid that you're taking to them. Talk to us about all that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in addition to what my colleague in the studios, Crystal, talked about, I think we need to look at it from possibly 2 major fronts. Yes, the issue of COVID-19 is one of the latest reasons for the increase in the numbers of displacement or the numbers of people who are in need of humanitarian aid. But additional to that, and most critical, is the issue of increase in insecurity. There's been spike in insecurity in the Northeast, more so, also in the Northwest and other parts of the country. Then you now add the issue of COVID, which has exacerbated the entire situation. If you take a critical look at 2016 basically, and then of course dovetailing into 2017, when we had a major military operation and that created the space for humanitarian, scale up, you realize that it's like we've gone back to that particular period where we had influx of victims from operational areas of the military, from the inaccessible areas to the limited accessible areas, then of course for the humanitarian workers to support. Because definitely the humanitarian workers definitely cannot operate within inaccessible areas. It's more difficult and more dangerous for humanitarian workers. The other third leg, but I wouldn't want to call it a third leg, is the increase in abduction and killings of aid workers. This has become a norm with the armed groups. So that has also not helped in the humanitarian response. But the other factor which many of us would not want to always talk about is the issue of funding. There has been lull in funding humanitarian support, because today, if you look at the humanitarian response in the Northeast, but in particular, it's been largely dominated by the international communities. On one part, you have the United Nations coalition that are leading a greater part of that. Then, of course, on the other hand, you also have the international NGOs. So the national NGOs are more or less really not in the equation like that. So our own response has been largely dominated by the UN and, of course, the international organizations. Not because the national NGOs don't have the capacity, but because over time the narrative have been that the national NGOs do not have the requisite capacities, and I believe it's deliberate, because the international communities want to continuously remain here to be able to provide the support and create jobs for themselves, as against the national NGOs operating here and also creating jobs for the teeming unemployed youth who have the requisite training and capacity to deliver most of these responses. So I think that's basically where I'm going to put it at for now.
You know, the thing is, let me bring it to you, Crystal. Last year, about 650 children, especially in the Northeast, suffering from acute malnutrition were attended to by aid workers. Now, the figure has it that there's bound to be an almost 50% increase in the number of people in need of aid. While these numbers appear to be increasing, are you seeing any effort to slow down?
Today, I don't see any effort to really slow it down, because even when you're trying to put those things in place, it's difficult because of the situation the world found itself as a result of the pandemic. I think my colleague has also talked about a very touching issue, which is funding. So really, when you look at the Northwest, where we have the biggest issues when it comes to the cases of malnutrition and all the humanitarian AIDS issues, it's you don't see local NGOs as it were playing there. It's just majorly international NGOs and agencies working there. But I feel like in the next, say, 1 to 2 years, we'll begin to see the impact of the work that is happening now. But today, really, because if you're looking at the world generally, we have a big issue in our hand, which is the pandemic. And everyone is trying to resolve that. And until that time, I don't see these cases really going down.
You know, while everybody tends to look at the pandemic, but before the pandemic came in, we had issues with, and I'll still take this to Emeka, but let me finish it here. Before the pandemic, we had malaria, we had Lassa fever, we had all these other illnesses that affected the citizenry, affected the children especially. So why is it that everybody tends to say the pandemic? We're looking at the pandemic as the major challenge to achieving some level of reduction in the speed of need for aid.
When one person is looking at an issue, it's okay. But when 136 people are looking at the same issue, then it's magnified. And that's exactly what is happening. When you think of malaria, malaria is reduced to majorly Nigeria and Africa as a whole. But we're talking of the pandemic that has affected every country in the world. And that's why it's kind of overshadowing the bigger issues that we have in our countries. So yeah, malaria, Lassa fever kills more Nigerians than COVID has done. However, COVID is magnified because it's affecting everybody else and not just Nigerians. So the talk around it is a little bit more, and I think that that's why the effect is actually affecting us. in Nigeria, we get more support, like we just said, for the Northeast and the Northwest who are majorly affected from international NGOs. And so if international NGOs are now talking COVID, it kind of just really affects they thinking of malnutrition. They can't even get the food across to you because they can't reach you as a result of that. But
Okay.
I think our bigger issue when it comes to humanitarian assistance and all of that is security, because it not only affects the people that you're trying to provide the aid for, but even the people that are taking the aid to the people.
Okay, Mark Umaru, who's the Acting Humanitarian Operations Manager, Save the Children International, joins us from our Borno Maiduguri studios. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Good to be on the program.
we're looking at this matter of the numbers appearing or increasing. Now, 2019, about 650 children or thereabouts were affected, but is it 650,000? Yeah, and then to get that figure correctly. Now, but now, with the pandemic, which Crystal has continued to mention, and Osemeka as well, plus all the other issues arising, there is the challenge of security for the aid workers, especially getting these things to these same children whose numbers that need aid is increasing. So what do you think can be done to work through this?
Okay, thank you. I would like to start just like the previous speakers have said. COVID-19 has greatly impacted on the humanitarian response. Before COVID-19, we had about 7.9 million individuals in need of humanitarian assistance. And currently that number has increased to 10.6 million individuals. And as you have rightly said, the issue of access is a problem because we have about 1.2 million people who do not have access to humanitarian assistance. Now, when it comes to access, we have to consider the hard-to-reach areas, and these are areas that humanitarian actors and organizations need to work closely with the military in order to gain access to these areas. So for me, I would say we need to coordinate and collaborate closely with the government to ensure that these people, these 1.2 million people that do not have access to humanitarian assistance are reached, and they are reached very quickly.
But how's that working out? We heard reports of some aid workers that were killed by insurgents not too long ago. So how safe are these aid workers, and what level of encouragement are they getting to even attempt to get aid to the people in need?
Okay, the situation in the Northeast, as we all know, is very tense. We have access issues, as you've mentioned. The safety of aid workers is a very crucial factor to consider, because if the health workers and the aid workers are not alive, there is no way they can provide or render that assistance. It's been very difficult, like I said, but there are areas where the fighting is intense, and then these are areas that for now we cannot go, but we're working very closely with the government. We have seen in some places access has been open, while in others access has still been challenging. But we have to understand that this is a very dynamic conflict, and we have things changing very rapidly by the day. And so, like I said earlier on, the safety of health workers is something that we consider very closely. And we also, as humanitarian organizations, have standard operating procedures, and we have guidelines that we work with to ensure that we're safe. In addition to that, we also work closely with the communities to improve participation, to improve coordination, to collaborate closely with them. And I think this has gone a long way as well in helping us to stay safe as we do our work.
Now, Mr. Moro, a number of aid workers have been killed. How much has this affected the morale and the resolve of aid workers and humanitarian organizations in those parts?
Well, I mean, it has been really challenging because these are colleagues of ours. We've worked with them, we've lived with them, we've interacted with them. But I believe the morale of humanitarian aid workers has not been dampened by these killings. If anything, it has encouraged us to even do more to ensure that those that require humanitarian assistance, the most vulnerable, are reached and supported. Another very important topic that is being discussed now is mental health and psychosocial support. And humanitarian organizations are also making this available for their staffs because of the nature of the environment we work in. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of trauma, but with mental health and psychosocial support and coming together as a humanitarian community to support one another, I believe our resilience is being strengthened.
Okay, let me come to Crystal. The numbers are increasing dramatically. How are you coping in terms of funding?
Funding is a very touchy topic. Interestingly, I was talking funding last week, and especially for the local NGOs, it's very, it's not as easy to access the needed funds that you need to do the work that you're doing. So for me, I would say the place to really stay on is continue to do the work that you're doing and make it visible. And I think that's where media support gets helps the work that we do. Because when the work, so for instance, you get a spotlight on your work, and then people get to know about it, and then they want to support the work that you're doing. And also, secondly, I would say for local NGOs to really find a way to continue to be credible, ensure that they're doing the right things that they're doing, then their counterpart agencies can support them for the work. But funding has not been it's not been easy at all. In addition, I would say that there's money available to do the work that you need to do. You just need to be at the right place and at the right time, and you'll probably get the support.
Osemeka, would you agree with her?
In what particular aspect would you want me to?
We've had
a lot has been said.
We've had this conversation about funding with you, I mean, some time back. But Crystal just said there are funds available for you to do what needs to be done. It's just that you have to be at the right place at the right time. Do you agree with her?
No, I don't. Honestly, I don't. I think I've been in this humanitarian response from 2013. We were among the first to, get into major operations in Maiduguri, then the scale up into the LGAs. Our organization operated in Goza, in Pulka, in Madagali, and these are hotbeds. If you recall, Goza was the caliphate at the time. And when many NGOs refused to go to the LGAs to provide support to the victims of insurgency, we were able to go in because, one, we had a different approach or a more adaptable approach to the community because, one, we are local. Two, we understand the people, the language, we speak the language, we understand the culture, and so many other dynamics that, revolves around this operation. However, I would say that over time, I must give kudos to the humanitarian coordinator, Ambassador Edward Callan. I remember vividly that he and his group, they set up what you call the Nigerian Humanitarian Fund, NHF. Largely, that fund is meant to provide capacity building and mentorship for the national NGOs with a view to pushing them forward or with a view to providing them that required capacity to be able to access funds from donors. Because like I mentioned earlier, the narrative from the international NGOs and of course a few UN organizations is that the NGOs, the Nigerian NGOs do not have the requisite capacity, which I can tell you is not correct. A lot of the operations that has happened and happened successfully was championed and headed by Nigerian NGOs and championed by the Nigerian aid workers. The issue of access is also another question you need to look at critically. But to complete this statement of funding, the NHF has not been able to, that's the Nigerian Humanitarian Fund, has not been able to live up to its main objective of providing, the capacity for the national NGOs, because it's been largely dominated and provided funding for the international NGOs as against the national NGOs. And if you ask questions properly, you will get all the answers you need. I know, that the humanitarian coordinator and of course a few of his colleagues are really sad with this development, because the major objective is to provide that, bridge for the national NGOs to be able to, meet the basic requirement by international and of course the major donors, so as to be able to, domesticate the response in Nigeria. We have more humanitarian crises springing up in the Northwest, and we've really not been able to pay serious attention in that region. I'm also aware, I believe you're also aware, you've covered it tremendously, the North Central is also a major hotbed with humanitarian displacement going on, in those areas. Then, of course, added to this COVID, so that has seriously exacerbated all of this. So the issue of access is that I know, that when we had major access issue in 2017, 2018, that the international NGOs relied 100%, relied on the national NGOs to be able to go into areas where they found it difficult to send their staff because of their policies that makes it difficult and impossible for them to do so. If you look at the success so far that we've recorded in the Northeast, in particular, I can tell you sincerely and honestly that those successes were brought about by Nigerians working with national NGOs and Nigerians who were also working with international NGOs. So the role of the national NGOs or local NGOs, as we want to call it, can never be overemphasized. And seriously, until we begin to domesticate and nationalize the response, the humanitarian response, I can tell you for free that we're going to be on this whole trajectory of lack of access or minimal access and all whatnot. Because even when you have access, the UN agencies with their very stringent policies makes it difficult for them to even go into such areas until it is, completely safe for them to go in. Likewise, the international NGOs, they also have very, very stringent safety and security measures that makes it very difficult for them to go into certain, relatively accessible areas where a lot of these IDPs that require immediate support, reside. My major fear and concern is that I wouldn't want us to go back to the era where we had major malnutrition challenges in the Northeast. I'm sure you recall when we had serious issues with malnutrition in the Northeast part of Nigeria, and people were dying on a daily basis as a result of, one, lack of access, then two, lack of provision of the needed support. But when were able to move in and provided this support, a lot of these issues were taken care of. And of course, we were able to mitigate the issues of wasting, stunting, and the rest of them. So I believe strongly that until we're able to change some of the strategies that has been adopted over time and deliberately, take on hand over the responsibilities or mentor or make sure that the response is centered around the national and the local NGOs, then we will begin to, see some of the results we require.
Yeah, Crystal, you wanted to...
And I think that myself and Emeka, we are on the same page. Maybe we just need to start asking ourselves, do we need to be dependent on donor funding? And probably if we wear a different hat, we will access funding from a different source, and then it will help us activate the work that we want to do. So if I'm not getting money from you, if I'm getting it from another source, you can't dictate where I'm going to do the work that I'm going to do. So I think...
Is that what is happening? Are the international agencies trying to dictate to you where to work?
I mean, for instance, if I say that I make my funding available for only people that are going to work in the Northeast and in a certain place, then if you're going to get money from me, you have to meet that criteria and do that. If I have a certain or strict guidelines on what you have to do with the money that I'm giving to you, then definitely you have to use my money in that form. If you're not complying with that, I'm not going to give you money. And so that's why I'm saying, with the spotlight on media, for instance, on national and local NGOs, you will access funds from individuals. And if you look at the COVID response of Nigeria, the private sector came in and did things differently. So we were not just getting funding from international organizations or but the private sector came in and did something about it. So I think...
How much funding are you getting from the local source?
So for instance, my own organization, we access 70% of our fund from Nigerians. So I don't have to rely on a donor to give me money. And
who will dictate to you what to do with the money.
What I'm going to do with my money. And so if I continue to make getting funding from a donor a big deal, I am not going to be able to execute the work that I want to do. I'm going to, if I am focused in the area of malnutrition, for instance, that means the children will suffer. And I won't be able to put any response in place to react or respond to whatever they are doing. So for me, I think local NGOs and national NGOs need to change their funding mindset. And if we can balance the different sources of where we get the funding that we get from, we'll be able to do more. And I think that that's the approach, and that's what we need. That's my own personal belief, and that's what we need to start doing differently. Because if you look at where we have a lot of issues, it's where, okay, the NGOs, international NGOs are saying this is the way we want it to go. The local NGOs are saying, no, this is how we think we should respond. And when you don't have the money, you can't respond.
Okay,
the way you want.
Mark, your focus is the children, and this matter of funding, as we wind down, how best do you think it can be resolved?
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add a little to the topic of the relationship between the INGOs and the national NGOs. We all need to understand, I think, that we are all humanitarians, first and foremost. We have about 2,000 national staffs, like myself, currently supporting the response. And we also take the topic of localization very seriously in Save the Children. And we do our best to ensure that we partner, we collaborate, and we also empower local NGOs, because if we fail to do that, then we're going to have a problem with sustainability. Now, regarding the issue of funding, the funding need after COVID setting went up to about 1.1 billion USD. And out of that, so far, humanitarian agencies have received just about 29% of the funding required. So we can see that there's a very huge gap. I believe, for me, we need to diversify our sources of funding. We need to ensure that we're not just focused on just the institutional donors, but we also have to look at leveraging on corporate donors as well as individuals. I think, for me, that is the way we can go in order to close the gap when it comes to funding. But the gap is really huge.
Thank you very much. Mark Umoru, Acting Humanitarian Operations Manager, Save the Children International, Nigeria, who joined us from our studio in Maiduguri. And we had Emmanuel Olisemeka, Country Director of Social Welfare, who joined us from our studio in Abuja, and Crystal Chigwe, Executive Director, Irede Foundation, who was with us in our studio in Lagos. Thank you all very much. And we do wish you all the best, and we do appreciate the work you're doing, and we wish you a very happy and fulfilling World Humanitarian Day next week. Thank you all very much. Sunrise will be back in a moment with another interesting conversation. Do join us.